Thank you. Can you all hear me okay over the mic? Great. This is the book that we were talking about. It's called Uptown, Portrait of a Chicago Neighborhood in the mid-1970s. Actually, John, it was almost 50 years ago that I started working on this book. I had just graduated from Northwestern, got my bachelor's and master's degrees in journalism there, and I was living in a far north neighborhood in Chicago called Rogers Park, almost on the Evanston boundary, if you're familiar with Chicago. And I was working downtown. And every day on my way into the Loop on the elevated train, affectionately known as the L train in Chicago, I would pass through a neighborhood called Uptown. And frankly, it terrified me. It was the poorest, ugliest, grodiest neighborhood you ever saw. Buildings were constantly burning down from arsonists. There were derelicts sleeping on the street. It just, you never knew what you were going to see in Uptown as you were going by it. But I was fascinated by photography, specifically documentary photography at the time. And there's a saying in the trade called F8 and be there. F8 in photographic terms means nothing special. It's just a middle of the road setting on your camera. And it's a way of saying the really important thing is to be there to get the shot when it happens. So there was another thing going through my mind that was motivating me to get out into this neighborhood. I was terminally shy at the time. I had real problems just talking to strangers. So I convinced myself that one day I was going to get off the L at Wilson Avenue, which was the heart of Uptown, with my Nikon, and ask the first person I saw if I could photograph him. Before I show you that person, I want to mention one other thing here. There's this website, bobrehak.com. That's my photography website. And if you go to it, over here, there's a page heading called Book. And you can download a free copy of the book, a PDF, and read the whole thing from cover to cover if you're interested. I did that because most of the copies of the book were wiped out in Hurricane Harvey. And this is my way of making sure that the history doesn't get lost. By the way, most of all of the photographs that I'm about to show you are in the permanent collection archives of the Illinois State Historical Society. This website that I set up to show the Uptown photos, this is one of my nature photos here, but the Uptown photos have gotten 12 million page views. When they went viral, it hit the front page of the Chicago Tribune, and to put 12 million in perspective, that's about 4 page views for every man, woman, and child in the entire city of Chicago. Let me get out of this. And what I'm about to show you is some of my favorite photographs from that book. So 1974, 49 years ago, I started this project. After I took the first photographs, I had several exhibitions at galleries in Chicago. And then the negatives sat in a drawer for the next 40 years. And as I was putting that photography website together that I just showed you, I decided to scan some of the negatives and put them online, and that's when they went viral. And that's when I realized there may be the potential there for a book. I mentioned that I promised myself I was going to photograph the first person I saw when I got off the L train. This was the gentleman, right here. He was having a jolly old conversation with himself. He was walking back and forth, kind of, ranting to himself. And, I looked at him and I said, oh my God, why did he have to be the first person that I saw? But, a promise is a promise. So I walked up to him and I said, excuse me, sir, do you mind if I photograph you? And he just stopped in his tracks and he looked at me and he said, why, sure, yeah, go ahead. And then as I pulled the camera up to my eye, he dropped to his knee and he adopted this praying posture and he shouted out, my name is Jehovah. And I thought, oh man, I've arrived in Uptown now. But it was an interesting introduction to the neighborhood. Almost everybody I met in the next 4 years was like that. They were very helpful, very open, very welcoming, very eager to have me take their pictures. This is a little bit of what Wilson Avenue looked like. It was the commercial heart of Uptown. And just to give you a sense of the place and time, how many compact cars do you think there are in that photograph? This, by the way, was during the middle of 2 OPEC oil embargoes in the 70s, where gasoline went from 10 cents a gallon up to almost $1 a gallon in those 4 years. And so, gasoline was at a premium. There was a lot of inflation and sticker shock associated with that. There's actually one compact car. If you see in the cross street, there's a little Volkswagen Bug crossing it. Everything else in that picture is land yachts. There were no such things as compact cars back then, except for the Volkswagen. Here's another thing that may not relate to you if you're under 50 or 60. Soft drinks used to come in bottles, glass bottles, as opposed to plastic bottles like this. And because the glass was valuable and could be recycled, most states had a redemption program on the bottles. If you turned your bottles in, you pay a deposit when you bought them at the grocery store. And when you turned them back in, you get that deposit back. And so what happens is, kids would fish through trash cans like the one you're looking at there, and they would try to find these soda bottles and then take them to the nearest grocery store to get enough money to buy a candy bar or a donut or, whatever. Certainly he wasn't going to make enough off of it to buy shoes. But in Uptown, shoes were a premium commodity. A lot of kids, families just couldn't afford them. By the way, Uptown is still one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the country. At Senn High School, which is the local high school, they speak 65 different languages. Can you imagine the problems you'd have teaching in that kind of an environment? Uptown was also host to a lot of halfway houses. Does everybody in here know what a halfway house is? Okay. A halfway house is usually a transitional environment for people who need help reintegrating into the community after they've been in jail or a drug rehab program or, could have been a mental hospital, something like that. It's a way to get them out and about in the community and talking with people and sort of normalizing their behavior after they've been in a different environment for maybe even a period of years. especially the people in prison. Uptown used to be one of the most elegant neighborhoods in Chicago, but then kind of development rolled past it. Has everybody in here heard of an actor named Charlie Chaplin? If you've heard of him, put your hand up. Okay. Yeah, Charlie Chaplin was the star of the silent film era. And believe it or not, back in that era, Chicago, not Hollywood, was the center of the film industry in America. Charlie had his film studio. It was called S&A Studios on Argyle Avenue in Uptown, and I've got some photographs, but they're nothing but a storefront, so I'm not going to bother with them today. So a lot of Chicago's elites used to live there, but then the neighborhood changed. The halfway houses moved in, the townhomes got subdivided, and folks like these moved in. And I mentioned that gasoline had really caused a lot of unemployment. The price of gasoline shot up, and that caused a lot of unemployment in America. So at the time, people were moving to Chicago for manufacturing jobs that the city still had from places like the American South, West Virginia, any place where they'd been dislocated. They came to Chicago looking for jobs, and because of the cheap rents, they wound up in Uptown. The gentleman on the right that you see has a medical malady called hydrocephalus. It's a swelling of the tissue around the brain. And his friend with the corncob pipe was from West Virginia. This is also one of my favorite photos from that time. We're out in front of the Uptown Theater here. And this young kid was, trying to find enough money to get in. He too was, fishing for bottles and whatnot. And I asked him if I could take his picture, and he struck this pose, against the fire hydrant. It's amazing what, just the diversity of kids in the neighborhood. He at least had shoes. This picture was taken on Christmas morning, and we're outside the Salvation Army soup kitchen on Wilson Avenue. Look at the long line of people waiting to get in and, get a meal. That's how desperate things were at the time. I found these 3 kids in a Sandlot. Notice that, again, 2 of them don't have shoes. Shoes were a luxury in those days, but there were a lot of, what do you call those, Susan? The things that live in soil, worms and stuff like that could be, that could bite you and infect you. So it was dangerous to go around barefoot, but the kids had no choice. One of the things that always struck me about this picture is how in any group of 3 kids, there's likely to be a nerd, a bully, and a bystander. And that's what you saw going on here. I asked them if I could take a group picture of them, and the nerd, got real stiff real fast, and the bully started making faces at him, and the other kid, with all the mush on his face, the mud just, was taking the whole thing in. This was another shot taken on Christmas morning. This was the daughter of a gypsy woman who lived on near Wilson Avenue. And she didn't have a winter coat. And you can tell from all the ice and snow on the stoop that it was very cold out there, but she needed to kind of get out and, try and burn off some energy. I'm walking down the street and I see this, little Madonna in the white dress, and I said to myself, man, I got to take that picture. And she posed for me and then invited me upstairs to meet her parents. And I got some more pictures of them in here later on. This is the Wilson L stop. In Chicago, there's a naval training station called, pardon?
Glenview Naval Air Station.
Glenview Naval Air Station, and this guy was in the Navy, and he was on a train trying to get up there. He didn't have a car. And at the time, there was a filmmaker named Russ Vixen who made a lot of softcore porn, and he's staring at this movie poster called Super Vixen, and I just thought, you know, boy, isn't that poignant. He was headed north to Glenview, not downtown to Chicago, and you know, this might have been the last woman he saw for a while, who knows. Okay, so I mentioned that, you know, the little girl in the white dress on the stoop invited me up to meet her parents. Well, these are the parents. And the thing that really struck me about this shot was not just the fact that the lady couldn't afford any diapers for the baby, but look at all the busyness going on in the photograph. Oh my goodness. You know, usually simplicity is the essence of a good photograph, but in this case, it's, you know, you've got the drapes that are one color, the wallpaper that's another pattern, the dress that's a third. You've got gargoyles, bowling trophies, every which thing, you know, on the mantle behind her. There's a plastic tree with a plastic orange on it. And she was just, you know, showing it all off. She was ecstatic about that. Gangs were a big thing in Uptown. We talked about the problems of growing up as a child in an environment like this. You know, the kids would get pressed into these gangs sometimes. And the gangs would have these initiation rituals. They'd have to go out and steal something or shoot someone or do something like that. And that's one of the things that made the neighborhood so violent. And it also altered the trajectory of a lot of kids' lives. It was difficult to stay on an honest, productive path because of all the gangs. These were the Latin Eagles, but there's another gang you'll see later on called the Latin Kings. And there was a third gang in the neighborhood called the Harrison Gents. All three of them had different turf, and they guarded their borders jealously. You know, if there was somebody like me crossing from one area into another, no problem. But if it was a kid, you know, who might have been in the opposite gang, well, look out. You know, you were taking your life in your hands. I had just come downstairs from photographing another family in their apartment, and I saw this young African-American boy lurking in the shadows of this thing, and he just felt lost to me. You know, I said, "Do you mind if I take your picture?" And he stared up at me, and you know, the contrast between the light and the dark and the emptiness of the feeling just has really always stuck with me. That's another one of my favorite pictures from the era. They weren't all bleak, though. You know, a lot of times the people around you determine your sense of possibilities. There were a lot of kids that grew up in families with, you know, hardworking dads and moms, and they were honest and straight, and they wanted the best for their kids. And in this photograph, you can see a lot of love. And no doubt, you know, this kid grew up on a good trajectory, and I'm sure had a productive life in front of him. This was a shot I took on Sheridan Road called Mona Varieties. Home of Mona Girl Cosmetics. If you look down the list on the lower right, you see Sex or Love. And I thought, you know, with the banana bikes in there, that again just said a lot about the environment in which these kids were growing up. This was another family where I had a sense of hope when I looked at this photograph, because the kid obviously hadn't lost his sense of humor, and the mother was happy, and there was a lot of good positive interaction between them. He was kind of showing off for the camera, look at my muscles, that kind of thing. And the scenes in Uptown constantly kind of shifted between those two extremes. There's one that was somewhere in the middle. This was a young white kid that I found on Broadway, and I asked him if I could take his photograph, and the first thing he did was pull out a cigarette and light it up. He wanted to show how tough he was. He was about 10 years old. I mentioned halfway houses. This woman was, I think, had some mental issues. If you notice, she's got some plastic keys hanging around her neck, and that jewel in the middle of her forehead. I asked her what that was, and she said, "That's the third eye." And I said, "What is the third eye?" And she couldn't really give me a good description, except she knew it was the third eye. There were a lot of handicapped folks that you constantly see on the streets of Uptown. This woman in the wheelchair was laughing or smiling at me about this girl in the halter top that had just walked by, as if she were remembering happier days. I call this shot gunplay. These are not real guns, they're plastic guns. But when I asked these kids, I was walking down the street and I saw them, shooting at each other with their toy guns. And I said, "Guys, do you mind if I take a picture of you?" And immediately the bigger one grabs the smaller one around the neck and points the gun at his head. There was a sort of subtle social indoctrination that was going on there. In impoverished neighborhoods like this, people get exploited a lot of the time. And this bar had stenciled on its door, "We serve a full ounce of whiskey," to attract the winos, because people are always ripping the winos off, right? And this was their way to get their share, a bigger share of the wino market. This was, we're coming out of the 60s here now, remember? And the 60s were the decade of the counterculture, and drugs were suddenly getting popular in America. And I found this guy on a street corner selling tokers and whatnot. He just had all the paraphernalia out there. He was selling it wide open. And if I were able with this presentation to zoom in, you'd see that he had a City of Chicago peddler's license to do it. That's how brazen things were there. Back before Uber Eats, there were guys like this, delivering food from the local supermarket. We have no pity in Latin King City. I mentioned that the Latin Kings were one of the other gangs up there, and they're notorious. They're all around the country, actually. Notice the misspelling in Pity, P-I-T-T-Y. A lot of times young kids, if you go back through the thousands of photographs that I took from this period, I was surprised at how many of the kids have dogs. I think the dogs were a source of unconditional love for them and also protection. This was one of the leaders of the Latin Kings with his girlfriend. I asked if I could take a photograph of them, and they immediately sort of locked into this embrace. And you know, when I started the photo blog, I later learned that all but one of the Latin Kings in Uptown had died before they reached 30 years old. They all had violent deaths somehow. They'd taken that wrong track, they'd fallen into the wrong culture, the one guy who was still alive was serving a life sentence in Joliet State Prison in Illinois. And had he not been sentenced to life, he would have been dead too. The guy that you're looking at here was pushed out of a third-floor window when he was 28. There's a kid, you know, they learn their survival skills at a young age. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, would be my guess. But he had this, it was like a homemade zip gun that, with this giant rubber band and a clothespin that latched onto a soft drink pop top thing. And man, I want to tell you, when he released that, it was enough to break plate glass. I mean, it achieved some acceleration. This looks like a happy photo, and for years I thought it was. You know, it was just two friends that were kind of, you know, wrapping their arms around each other when the local street photographer said, "Can I take your picture?" And in response to the blog, when it went viral, I learned people started sending me hundreds, if not thousands, of emails saying, "Oh, I'm in that photograph, and that's my friend, and here's what happened to him." The kid on the right was one of John Wayne Gacy's first victims. Does anybody here know who John Wayne Gacy was? Besides Professor Barr. John Wayne Gacy was and I think still may be America's largest mass murderer. And he hung out in Uptown. That's where he recruited most of his victims. He would go to the day labor agencies and he would promise people, you know, a day's wages. He pretended to be a contractor. They get in his truck and they disappear forever. When they finally got on to how this was all working, they found something like 56 or 58 bodies buried in his backyard in his cellar. And the kid on the right was one of them. I learned that from the kid on the left. That's how mean the streets were. You've heard the expression mean streets. Well, this was it. I also mentioned about, you know, people coming up to Chicago from West Virginia. I call this shot Street Strummers. The day labor agency that can see the word help over there on the right. That's where Gacy recruited a lot of his victims. These guys, you know, were playing their banjo and guitar, looking for, you know, handouts, money, and they were actually really good. And they'd play in these clubs like the Club Granada that you see across the street during the night. Boxers were huge in Uptown. Don't ask me why, but Max Merrick, who was the only man ever to beat Joe Louis. Do we all know who Joe Louis was? Joe Louis was widely regarded as one of the greatest prize fighters of all time. He was the world heavyweight champion for more than a decade, long before Muhammad Ali ever came along. Max Merrick was the only boxer ever to beat Joe Louis. The guy in the white suit that you see here was named Spider Webb, W-E-B-B. And he too was a heavyweight boxer. A lot of bars in Uptown. Here's a guy who was, remember in the 70s there was this war called Vietnam going on. And this guy had lost a leg to a landmine in Vietnam. But, he was trying to adjust and make it and move on with his life. I'm walking down one of the streets in Uptown and I see this beautiful little garden. I forget what they call this style of horticulture. Where the Japanese miniaturize everything. It was like an oasis in the middle of a desert. And it just goes to show you the diversity of the folks who lived there. Kids love to have fun. I'm rolling down Wilson Avenue. That's the street you see here, when all of a sudden in the other direction, this group of kids on roller skates comes up to me and they hit the brakes right in front of me and they start giggling and laughing, and I snap this shot. And it just showed, I don't know, I love it because there's so much exuberance in the kids there. Again, during Vietnam, the Army's looking for a lot of people. And this old guy with a paper bag, which had a bottle of wine in it, is trying to convince the recruiter to take him, as if he was going to meet the Army's specs. But there was a $100 signing bonus, and he really wanted that signing bonus. I don't know much about this kid. He was very silent. He was a teenager, and I asked if I could take his shot again. I would always ask before I photograph someone. I'd never try and sneak shots. And by the way, I get them to sign model releases too, because I knew that someday I might want to publish these. And he just had this, like he was staring out at me from under the brim of this hat, a very solemn thing. He never said a word. He did sign my form. I paid him $1 to make it legal, and off he went. In Chicago in the winter, it can get pretty cold. And I call this shop the guy with two hats. If you don't have a place to live, if you're living on the street, you have to wear all your clothes all the time, or somebody's going to steal them. He actually was from Ireland, and he spoke with a heavy Irish brogue. There was a television series on in the middle of the 70s called Kung Fu. It was a karate movie, and it was all the craze. It was one of the biggest TV series of the 70s. And you may recognize the wallpaper in here. This was one of the older kids that belonged to that Gypsy family. And when I was up there, I saw him practicing these karate moves in his bedroom, and there was a shaft of light coming through, and I said, ooh, move over here a few inches. And I grabbed the shot. That's one of the few times I ever actually tried to pose someone. But you would see kids on the street all the time, jumping out of windows, practicing their karate jumps and, things. It was just incredible. This guy his name was Willie. Willie was actually, despite his fearsome appearance with the acne, he was a very kind and gentle soul. When I started to photograph him, he had this big smile on his face. Then I must have looked a little disappointed somehow, because all of a sudden, without me saying a word, he gave me this scowl that you see here. And that's the shot that I remembered him by. Uptown had more bars per block than any other place I've ever seen in the world. There would often be 3, 4 different bars on a block, and this is a guy that was hanging out in front of one of them. He was more than eager to sign my model release form and get a buck so he could go back in and get his bud. This shot has a backstory to it. It looks like there might be some sexual exploitation going on here. But the girl and her mother had driven up from somewhere in the south, might have been Arkansas, and they were sleeping in their car on the streets in Chicago. And this guy said, well, listen, I've got, an empty room in my apartment. Why don't you, come and use that instead? And I went and I interviewed the mother and verified the story, and this is a story about a photograph that says appearances can sometimes be deceiving. Back when I had my advertising agency, I had an African-American client, and she saw this photograph hanging up in my office, and she said, "Take that down." I mean, it really disturbed her. But I said, well, there's a backstory here. It's not what it appears to be. This is really an act of kindness. This is one of my favorite shots from the series. These 3 black girlfriends all wound up to be happy, productive, normal adults. And you can almost see it in their faces in this shot. They all live in the western suburbs of Chicago. They got married, they have careers, kids, grandkids in some cases by now. The big struggle in this neighborhood was to get out of it, into something with more of a semblance of what you or I might call normalcy. There was a kid who ran into a frying pan. The Harrison Gents, that's the 3rd gang that I talked about. Young father with kids. Again, this is sometime between Christmas and New Year's. It was very cold, and he had all this, these kids bundled up. It just, the way they were bundled up in their Sunday finest, this was actually on a Sunday morning, they were on their way to church, always stuck with me. Here's another Gypsy family with a kid. You see a lot of love there. People ask what's going on here. Can anybody guess? They're trying to keep their car battery from getting stolen. They would lock the hood down. This is outside the Aragon Ballroom, where they would have a lot of rock concerts. Teenagers are teenagers anywhere in the world. They love rock and roll, and these kids were waiting to get in for a big show. People sleeping in cars. This was from a place called the Guatemala Cafe. One time I stopped in there, my hands were freezing, I needed to switch film, and I was having trouble doing it because it was so cold, so I stopped into the Guatemala Cafe to get a little bit warmer. And I met this lady, and she kind of took me under her wing and fed me some empanadas. And this little girl on the right was the daughter of the woman you see here, and it was part of a family business. They'd migrated here legally from Guatemala, and they were trying to, better themselves. And it was a great little restaurant, and it stayed in business for 40 years. That's how good the value was that they offered. And in fact, the young girl still writes me to this day. She occasionally sends us, a big cooler of empanadas at Christmas time. This was a sad story, unfortunately. This lady is an American Indian, and she was on her way to the grocery store when her husband punched her in the face, took the money that she was going to use to buy groceries, and knocked her to the ground. And you can see their daughter crying there, and the woman crying, and she's looking at the bar that he ran into with the money to drink it up. Almighty Latin Kings. And this is the last shot that I come to. Wrigley Field, where the Chicago Cubs play baseball, is on the southern boundary of Uptown. And man, do the kids there love baseball. And, they're always trying to look tough and, emulate the big leaguers. And I just love the character that you see in this shot, especially that little kid peeking out at the bottom underneath the elbow. So that's the presentation. Again, please download the book. There are little captions that explain what's going on in each of the photos and put it in a historical context. The other thing I was going to say is share it with your friends, get it out there. It's amazing how the environment that you can grow up in can alter the trajectory of your life for better or worse. Some people fall to the poverty, and other people rise above it. And Uptown had a lot of both, and you'll see examples of both in the book.
Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more content from LSC-Kingwood.